as he or they if you need to. Who knows what happened there? I'd also, there's a panel. I hope they can introduce themselves in alphabetical order.
Alex, she, her, please.
It's you, Marina. We were the best judges that we could get for you. Like we do know how to operate technology, I promise. Can we have I think Macharia is next.
Yeah, Macharia here, pronouns he, him, best of luck.
William, no preference, good luck.
And we also have Marina.
Yeah. Hi, Marina, no preference.
Cool, great. So we're going to do that now for the teams as well, and hopefully in doing so we'll have a few less problems. So what we'd like to know the order you're going to be speaking in. We'll check that we can hear you, which hopefully we will be able to. We'll also check that you're happy to be streamed, because as indicated in the chat box right now, the final is going to be streamed. So you've got instructions there if you're not comfortable being streamed for how you can opt out of that. And the opt out, of course, as always, is something you can change as that goes through. So we need to have a look at that at the same time, but also if there's a particular way you'd like to be referred to, that's your opportunity to let us know. So in terms of opening government, and also, by the way, if you're not a participant, behind your screen, when we're introducing the teams, you should be like furiously clapping and applauding and whooping, because even though we won't be able to hear you, I think we'll feel the energy of it. So in opening government, we should have Ateneo 1.
Hello, David speaking first, no preferred gender pronouns.
Toby speaking second, no preferred pronouns.
Okay, great. In opening opposition, we should have LSE A.
Speaking first is Matt, here they.
Ahmed second, no preference.
Okie doke. In closing government, we should have TCD Phil A.
Jack speaking first, I prefer he or they, thank you.
And Dylan speaking second there, he, thank you. Best luck, all teams.
And in closing opposition, we should have Sydney B.
Hello, I'm Ellie, speaking member, no preference.
I'm Sophie, speaking whip.
Fantastic. Great. In which case, standing orders are, hopefully as they've been throughout the tournament, speeches 7 minutes long. Between the first minute and the 6th minute, points of information can be offered, should be offered, and indeed, please try and accept at least one in each of your speeches. At 7 minutes, your time is up, so you should begin wrapping up, because at 7 minutes 15, I'll unmute myself and I'll let you know that you're out of time, at which point you can do whatever grandstanding and big sort of dramatic finishes you need to do for the sake of this being a final, but we won't be taking any notes after that point. What we won't be doing is keeping time in the chat for you, because we'll be busy judging the debate, so please keep your own time, keep each other's time, and only offer points of information at the correct time. Hopefully at this point we've got the opportunity that we need for Orgcom to have the information they need. But if not, I can stall for some more time. I think we've done a pretty good job of that with tech issues. So hopefully Orgcom have what they need on that, and we'll be ready to begin momentarily. I don't know. They'd have told us if they weren't ready. Who cares? We're going to begin. In which case, on the motion that this House opposes established states actively curating and promoting a patriotic sense of national identity, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open the case for opening government. Here.
Hello, can I be heard?
You can.
Yeah, I've just turned on the roast beef lamp, so I guess if my camera becomes unnecessarily bright, that's like just cope, I guess. I can't turn off the lamp mid-speech. I'll take POIs in chat. Good morning, world. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Picture a boot stamping on the face of humanity again and again, forever. Without being free from patriotism, we are never free. First, establishing the grounds of this debate. States that are established have been around for a while, they have a history likely of empire, and are not in immediate danger of collapsing. OP cannot pick and choose the best patriotic sense of national identity to promote. If they could, there wouldn't really be a debate, and must accept the one most likely to emerge. We suggest the one most likely to emerge encourages and is increased state impunity, excludes minorities, and is to the primarily privileged and to the benefit of the majority, and whitewashes the history of the state. We anticipate that the characterization battle will be the most heavily contested ground of this debate, and so we will provide you 5 structural reasons for why an active defense looks like resisting change, suppressing diversity, and indoctrinating children from a young age. First structural reason is that people in power simply have an incentive to stay powerful and stay in power, which means they have an incentive to exclude others that may challenge them, typically along racial and ethnic lines. Secondly, is that they want you to view the state as proclaiming prosperity, which means adhering and even admiring many of the potential holdovers from the past and conservative outlooks of that past, which means they are substantially more likely to resist change. Thirdly, is that there's an incentive to tie this to the particular identity of whatever group there is in power to benefit from notions of glory, honor, and desirability. Fourthly, is that it is indeed beneficial for politicians to set in groups and out groups deliberately, to set up scapegoats to draw away and distract from personal failings or from policy failings. And fifthly, is that it is simply strategic to create up a set of vague national patriotic values to appeal to when election time comes around, where you can point to other politicians and say they don't appeal to these same values. So for all these reasons, it is immediately clear that the characterization of patriotic is not friendly, and indeed is actively hostile to those not within the systems of power. The second and other deliberate thing to characterize is that the comparative without active attempts from states would be one where we witness the dissipation of exclusive national identities based around patriotism. That is an increasing amount of less and less attachment to the state. Mayhaps you might still love the state, but do not view it as a primary locus of identity. There are three structural reasons for this. The first is that we are living in an increasingly globalized world where you are exposed to other cultures and can take parts from them, or you can increasingly identify with them, whether it be through online interaction or through immigration. Secondly, is that the history and fact-finding allows you to find out things about your past that are much more unsavory, and knowing more about the truth and knowing more about the world would probably make you less proud about the terrible things in the past. And thirdly, is that developing new communities allows you to provide alternatives for that state history and that, patriotism. I want to first observe that with these incentives, the default is not a balance. The default is when states attempt to curtail access to this globalization, curtail access to this immigration, and curtail access to the truth, it is when you get state domination of patriotism, and hence these incentives can only activate in a world where you don't have the state actively curating this. Now that we've set the ground for the debate, let's move on to the first argument: state power and accountability. We think this emboldens state corruption and violence for three structural reasons. The first is that it simply makes states less accountable because politicians can disguise and obfuscate attacks on their policy as attacks on the state, as attacks on the nation, as attacks on the fabric of the country itself, trying to weaken it. Secondly, is that they can exclude naysayers from political discourse as unpatriotic, as being too critical of the founding fathers, too critical of the Constitution, and indeed working against the interests of the nation, because we have a core idea of the nation as being above all else and important to protect. Thirdly and finally is that they can also make use of appeals to fear of the degradation of this patriotic sense of identity, that we are losing our way of life, and that notably an echo from white nationalists, we are being replaced. So it is this appeal to this community that allows them to drum up feelings of fear and anger, to whip up people into an outrage, to discriminate against minority groups, and most importantly, to get their way. What does this manifest in terms of outcomes? The first is that it manifests in the form of force, whether it be through other states, such as justifying military expansions to fund the military-industrial complex by putting blood and guns in the US, into the Middle East, from Israel, for example, into other countries, from the UK, from the SAF in Iran, and so on and so forth. This is used to justify violence in other countries to a massive scale, harming hundreds of thousands while remaining immune from public accountability. But beyond that, there's also instantiated violence against the public, whether it be justifying police brutality against minorities, because violence against them is not only accepted, it is encouraged. The second consequence of this motion is that this also creates political stagnation, where established parties can cling to legacies and make it impossible to get important political change, like important social changes, improving social liberties, improving the quality of education, leaving many people to suffer and languish in systemic poverty year in and year out, make it difficult for you to get important social change like gay marriage and so on. But then third and final thing is that this leads to simply worse economic outcomes. It leads to the entrenchment of certain areas with substantially less access to welfare, because this money instead goes to vanity projects to dedicate to the name of patriotism, to dedicate to the sense of cultivating a national identity, while at the same time ignoring the same people that have been left behind from that national identity. The end of this first argument should be obvious as for why this debate winning. It means on a massive scale, states are capable of abusing their citizens, making their life worse, and most importantly, making life worse for people in the future. I'll take a POI from CEO before I move on to the second argument.
Yeah, there are many other forms of identity formation that also benefit elites. For example, forming identity around ethnicity or religion. Why don't politicians just appeal to those instead?
Because this is the most powerful. This justifies the use of violence. Most importantly, it allows you to exclude them from the boundaries of that country itself. And most importantly, the use of the nation justifies, increases, and amplifies every other form of exclusivity, whether it be through ethnicity, gender, or race. So maybe that might be true. It gets way worse on opposition. The second argument is that life gets much, much worse for minorities in three key respects. The first is simply that minority cultures get suppressed under the pretense of trying to preserve and create a single national identity, whether it be being unable to learn your mother tongue in certain countries like in the Philippines or in Malaysia and being taught to learn English or the language of the majority, or for example, historical whitewashing to make you proud of your state by not learning about the atrocities of that state, which is not only itself incredibly damaging to the culture and society and the unification of these communities, but it also means that they themselves experience direct discrimination and inability to self-actualize their identity. Secondly, though, is that it's much harder to immigrate, which particularly harms many vulnerable minorities outside that country that could use a more prosperous life in these areas. And thirdly, is that they are simply less included within the national fabric, which means that it is less normalized for them to exist. It is less normalized for them to be human, and it's more instantiated violence against them, more acceptable to combine against them, and more acceptable to exclude them. At the end of this speech, it is clear. Patriotism is not, never will be, and will not be good. That's why we propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition to begin the case for opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Cool. Can I confirm I'm clearly audible?
You are.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. David correctly identifies that nationalism can be bad, but misunderstands that the comparative is not a world where the nations of the world dissolve their borders and everyone lives happily under some kind of Soros egalitarianism. I posit that communitarian, ethnic, and yes, national identities still exist on-side government. The problem is that when they emerge organically and in a majoritarian, exclusive, or fragmented and harmful manner. One response to opening government before I win the debate on these claims. I don't think the counterfactual is that people move toward the abolition of states. 3 reasons. Firstly, the idea of globalism is just inherently empirically limited in terms of appeal. Insofar as on either side of the house, the vast majority of people in the world live in states. It's what they grew up with, it's what they're familiar with, and this is likely quite a scary narrative, one that takes a very long time for them to internalize, or one they're not exposed to outside of like liberal academia in the West. Secondly, global identity and a dissolution of the nation state is vague and open to contestation. That is, it might say we should dissolve borders, but whatever replace it is probably very, very unclear and nebulous, and thus probably harder to identify within a cohesive manner. I posit that people, in the absence of this cohesion, probably default to their racial or ethnic community instead. But thirdly, there's far more likely to be a reversion to what is more proximate to you, e.g. tribal identities, communitarian identities, or a national identity built around your own local community as opposed to being one that is top-down enforced by the state, because your community is far more proximate to you, and you probably identify with this far more than some nebulous idea of globalism. The first claim I want to make in opening opposition is why states are likely to promote this narrative well. And note as a point of characterization, I think this looks like national curricula. This looks like promoting national anthems, holidays, and things like this. Why are they unlikely to do it in the worst possible majoritarian way OG assumes this is? I have 5 reasons to respond to David's 5 reasons. First, established states have incentives to not generate instability internally to the state. That is to say, if a national narrative is incredibly radical or socially repressive, that is probably bad, probably likely to generate social discohesion and backlash from various groups of the segment, because most people are relatively moderate and don't like to see mass repression going on in their neighborhoods, even if it doesn't target them. So there's an inbuilt check against the absolute worst narratives that exists when it's the state doing it on the top down. Secondly, established states are still electorally accountable to minorities, right? Like, yes, they don't have as much power, but minorities can still play kingmaker in multi-party systems when 2 political parties are polling roughly evenly, and then they can make or break which party has dominance, and then thereby exact concessions from the party that they then put into power. Or they can appeal to left-wingers' concerns and bring them on board with social change, which is what I proved in the last debate. Thirdly, established states don't want to suffer call-outs or ostracization into the international arena. This is the reason why Israel doesn't just annex the West Bank, right? And why there's a Morocco-Fosun conflict in the Western Sahara, as opposed to like Morocco annexing that as well. Because states don't want backlash to that degree, and therefore they're unlikely to promote a sort of national identity that engenders mass amounts of violence for this reason, because they don't want to face either sanctions or international ostracization. Fourthly, governments represent large segments of the electorate. That is to say that most of the electorate is not racist, and most states are pluralist to an extent. What this means is that over time, there's a general incentive for national narratives to move towards the median, right? Insofar as they want to take into account the aggregate of the largest number of people across society. So I just don't think on face it's likely to be the most radical as they seem to characterize. But finally, And this is critical because it flips all of OG. The motion says curating, which means that because society is generally liberalizing over time because of the internet and access to it in a wide variety of the world, because of younger generations becoming increasingly tolerant as a result of things like the decline of organized religion, the liberation of women, and the increased prominence of cultural integration across multiple community lines, and large migration waves leading to demographic shifts that mean policy is necessarily more race-blind as a result of politicians being answerable to more diverse voter blocks. This means that over time, the curation of national identity is likely to become more progressive, and critically, the state has leverage over how it becomes progressive insofar as they have all the incentives I've already given you to make it so. But finally, why is the counterfactual narrative likely to be far, far worse? Note that on either side, a formation of national identity will likely arise. The problem on op is in the absence of a top-down imposition by governments, it's likely to be bottom-up. And I posit bottom-up is far worse. Why? First, when organic community narratives likely emerge, they're far more likely to be majoritarian and built around ethnic or communitarian lines. The reason this is true is because insofar as these people have a large amount of voice in the public square, the most attention to having many followers, and often deep roots, they're likely to default towards pushing this conception in many instances. The comparative, and I want to be very clear about this, is yes, these people also have influence over the state. However, the state is accountable electorally to multiple groups of people and also accountable internationally to various constituency groups that promote inbuilt moderation mechanisms. So even in our worst case, where on either side of the house, a hegemonic and racist identity rises to the top, we have more recourse for minorities and moderates to influence the state than because they can vote these people out of office. The comparatives, these organic narratives, are impossible to sanction because they don't hold elected office. Secondly, these narratives, when they emerge, are more likely to be fragmented. The reason why this is true is because you are likely to get competing interpretations of what constitutes national identity without the state as a centralizing force to promote unity. This is where myths like the lost cause of the South in the United States come about. Because when the state doesn't exercise as much discretionary control over what the national narrative is, states can pick and choose what the most proximate narrative to them is. This means that A, you likely get what I term a race to the bottom in terms of competing national identities or regional orientations. Because insofar as there might be some degree of people wanting to break into the public square and their competing identities, you now shift the calculus on the part of people promoting the identity to promote the more radical ones to gain media attention and gain traction. The comparative was when the state seeps this into every facet of people's upbringing in the curricula, in the education system, in patriotic identities. They don't have to move towards radicalism because it's already something that's inculcated from a very young age. When there's competing identities in the marketplace of ideas, they become far more radical. But even if you don't buy that this happens, there's just more confusion about what actually constitutes a national identity. I think that's very bad intuitively because it makes it harder for people to understand what national identity is and thereby self-express and self-validate their own expression through that. This is incredibly harmful, but this confusion also means that you're more likely to allow demagogues and populists to exploit tensions and things like this to a greater degree. But finally, even if national identity emerges well, it's likely to be more resistant to influence when states don't take active steps in shaping it. So even if progress happens more slowly on both sides, it happens more staggeredly and at regional levels, rather than happening all out to the top-down imposition. So even if progress is symmetric and it moves toward identities that are better on both sides, it happens far faster when you can do top-down imposition. I want to weigh this against OG, but before that, I'll take closing.
So plenty of illiberal and yet nonetheless established states are explicitly ethnic or religious in their national identity. So what is the motion non-comparative in those contexts?
Nope, they're still probably ethnic, right? But now there's more accountability for all the reasons I've given. Weighing this against OG, even though I concede everything OG says, that this narrative will be majoritarian and bad in some instances, I've proven there are mechanisms by which progress can happen. So therefore, we outweigh them even in the worst case. That also answers Dylan's POI. The second claim I want to make is why people are entitled to access national identity on a principled level. I think that the state is a vehicle through which people, myself and everyone, make sense of the world. It is something I use to relate to myself and others and to make sense of my place in the world. That is to say, I relate to being American in the same way that everyone else relates to being their national identity. It is easier for me to make sense of my identity when there's cohesive messaging. The world of government is one where you cheer a stadium of football fans without being sure what to cheer for. It's a world where you draw in your first breath and exhale your last in a state of moral incoherence. On our side of the house, we give people the ability in Argentina to cheer for Messi unambiguously and know what they're cheering for when Messi wins the World Cup. On our side of the house, we give people the ability to express their national identity to the fullest possible degree without the moral incoherence of competing identity that makes them never sure what they're promoting. I think on this debate, you need to stand for coherence, stand for self-expression, and stand with opening opposition, and I am incredibly proud to stand at opening up.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for his fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government. Hear, hear.
Hello, I'll take POIs in chat. Sorry, the angle is big.
The worst atrocities of our time have come from powerful states enabled to act with impunity by the blindfold of patriotism. It's the blind reverence to the Constitution that keeps school shooters a threat in 2022. Reverence to empire that prevents the UK from paying reparations it has long owed. That means monuments are built in the streets where so many are starving. Attempts to manufacture this national identity are not only counterproductive, they lose the state so much and embolden it to do the worst atrocities. First line of response I wanted to ask is, what sort of patriotism is likely to emerge and be promoted by already powerful states? The attempt at OLO is to suggest that the comparative for us is one where people default to communitarian identities. The response to this is several things. The first and most important is that these communitarian identities are all uniquely different from nationalism in that these identities don't have a centralized mechanism to use and abuse power in established states. You can't organize an ethnic militia. You can't extract taxes from people of your same religion, which is why even if people default to these, the ability through which they would be able to manifest the kinds of abuses that are bad simply don't happen to the same extent on our side of the house. But further, I'd point out, many of the incentives they give for why people want to coexist peacefully within the state also exist within these communities. Like, if the state doesn't want to antagonize others, surely ethnic groups don't want to antagonize each other as well. The difference being then, and the weighing on it, is on the capacity to antagonize, which we show is something that's unique to the state. The second point I want to note is that many of the responses they give simply don't engage with the nuance we set up from David, which is to say, Matt gives you 5 reasons for why this is against the interest of the state to set up the national identity poorly. But the observation we make from David is that the people who are setting up this national identity and curating which aspects to choose are individual leaders who are powerful and benefit from the establishment of that system. So sure, it might not be a good thing for the US to have a broad military presence, but it benefits figures like Bush. It benefits figures like Nixon. And it's because these people have the resources and infrastructure of the state that they're able to peddle and override other narratives and challenges to that authority. So this is simply non-engaging with the context we set up. The third line of response I want to launch is to flip the emergence of communitarian identities. I would note that people who feel excluded by the state on their side of the house, insofar as they will still exist and OO doesn't give you a reason why they don't, will still have to coalesce against communitarian identities when the national identity fails around them, which is why minorities enclave, which is why immigrants tend to group together and don't see themselves as members of the new state. It's just that when these groups coalesce in their world, the process of coalescing is far, far worse for 3 different reasons. First, the only way by which these people can gain any ground in the state is to attempt to override the national identity, which is often zero-sum. You can either choose to teach history from the perspective of Native Americans, which is to say it was a genocide, or to teach it from the perspective of white Americans, which is to say it was integral to making our nation whole, or whatever the fuck they say in order to justify atrocities. The second thing to point out is that the state now needs to actively oppress these people and prevent them from coalescing in the first place. There's no reason why ethnic identities or affiliating with your ethnic group immediately results in violence or immediately results in bad outcomes. I would suggest that many people are able to do this peacefully. Many people are able to do this in a meaningful way where they enjoy their own subcultures and enjoy their own groups and are able to coexist with others. The problem is that their attempt and their ability to organize and do this is a threat itself to the state, which is why the state prevents them from doing so in a manner that is violent and terrible. But thirdly, I would point out as a note of weighing, the people who need to coalesce again around these identities on either side of the house are by definition the people who are the most vulnerable and the ones that are least served by the state and have least ability to influence what is curated. If these people have far more freedom and far less antagonism because there's no incentive for any individual ethnic group in our world, then they're far better off on ours. The second line of response I want to launch quickly is to the principle. I think this isn't really a principle insofar as any other aspect of identity guarantees this. There's no reason why the state should grant you purpose. If anything, religion, your identity, or your own expressions of purpose can do this as well. You have no right to access this, and it certainly shouldn't come at the cost of everything else we run. 2 things then, and substantive. First, how does the promotion of the state weaken citizens' ability to hold the state accountable? And I want to note the utter lack of response from LO to the material we heard out of David. It's not just that an identity set up by the state itself, it's harmful. It's the fact that once you've set up an identity, you need to constantly and actively defend this identity against all potential threats that might be set up around it. And it was the particular manifestations of the attempt to set up that identity that were harmful. The fact that you are resistant to change, the fact that you have a narrow construct of national national symbols that you reveal with sacredness and are unwilling to take criticism for. The fact that it's seen as un-American to criticize Thomas Jefferson for holding slaves or for them going to war and colonizing places like the Philippines. And I want to note, this analysis in particular wins the debate because regardless of whether or not you think the patriotic identity, they're capable of setting up a good patriotic identity on that side of the house. The problem is that the level to which that patriotic identity serves the needs of the people will change over time. But the problem is that the way you try to defend that and the way you need to keep it relevant is to stop other identities and other interpretations of the national identity from emerging. So it's the fact that you tried to make an active defense of this that is in and of itself harmful. But secondly, as a note of weighing here, we point out that it's just extremely expensive to maintain this national identity. It's things like the building of monuments, things like the whitewashing of history, and things like purposely obfuscating facts using state resources that just have such a massive opportunity cost on net and when you scale them up. Before I move on, I'll take a from CO.
Yeah, many Democrats in the US use patriotism to celebrate America as a nation of immigrants. Why is this possible given your characterization of elites just prescribing a static narrative?
Because Republicans similarly shit on it and say that you are the wrong kind of immigrant. I'd be much happier if people didn't have to appeal to fit in with the American identity in the first place, where they could just be their ethnicity and just be their culture in a world where it isn't presumed that they should or should not be excluded from the national fabric. It's the reverence of fitting in that is the problem. In our world where people see the state as a means to an end rather than something that is good in and of itself, we get far better outcomes. Secondly, on substantive, I want to note how there's also no response similarly to the fact that the promotion and active defense of these national identities as a corollary of my first point often leads to the exclusion of the vulnerable and the justification of oppression by part of the majority. And this is important because it's not just that states will have bad incentives and often want to crack down on either side of the house. The difference is when states crack down on that side of the house, majorities now have frameworks by which to justify that crackdown, to say BLM protesters were un-American and that is the reason why we forced them down. And the reason this is important is because patriotism uniquely prevents you from engaging with the core topics and core focus of these social movements. It creates an alternative set of values that appeal to you even when those values are rubbish, but they're protected, they're uncriticizable, and they're unflinching. For all of those reasons, proposed.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for what was a fine speech. I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
You are.
Am I visible?
You are.
Fantastic. Making sure I got my phone. Okay, I think I have everything. Great. 3, 2, 1. It's the euphoria you feel in your bones when you read your national history, the ability to see a guiding light in the void of the universe that tells you belong in the world, the capacity to walk through the roads and feel a connection to the soil and remains underneath. A national identity is a home in the hurricane we call life and an island of hope in a sea of despair. It's a boot where one elevates themselves, not steps on the necks of others. The first thing I want to do is explain why it's inevitable for some national identities to take form. Why is this the case? One, you see other states' national identities. Secondarily, it's a historical practice that people know about and see throughout time. And thirdly, people to some extent feel a deep urge to make sense of their position and the place they call home. What is the upshot of this and why does this matter further on? A national identity will manifest on either side. The question is what form it takes. On ours, it's better. That is to say, a hammer is inevitable in this debate. On Gov, they use it to destroy. On ours, we can build. I want to engage very clearly with the characterization. They give a few things to explain why it's going to be bad. One, people in power have incentive to stay in power. Note critically, they don't explain why it's easier to stay in power being dicks to minorities. Comparatively, mass analysis is more persuasive intuitively, insofar as the more inclusive you can be, the less people you have to stamp out, and the less potential conflict that exists to create instability. Secondarily, they say it's the incentive to tie identity to whoever's in the majority. But this is critical. They never say why it must be zero-sum, and you have to exclude the minority. There's nothing inherent about it for why it must be the case. Here's why there's a capacity to be inclusive, because Gov gave us the analysis themselves. History is malleable. States can make fake myths to underestimate pre-revolutionary conflict and say everyone was on the same side to get the independence that they sought for. The fact that it's malleable is why we can make it inclusive and why states have the incentive to. Thirdly, they say the incentive to create scapegoats. And here's where I will engage with the argument on state power and accountability, because they're inextricably linked. They say politicians can disguise, they can exclude naysayers as too critical and have political capture and vanity projects, and they are able to use scapegoats to do a lot of these things. I'm going to flip this. It can be used against the state for disgracing the country against all of these mechanisms. Why is this more likely to take the case? Because states are upheld in the national identity through positive values. Everybody says the country is fair, it's strong, it's just. They cannot obfuscate those values with negative actions because everybody agrees those actions are bad. So you can never say, it's fine, we were corrupt, because everybody knows corruption is bad. So it's easy for the opposition to say, no, what you did was wrong and you disgraced our founding fathers. You disgraced the country that I call home and the money that I invested in the soil that I grew my kids up in. In other words, the national identity is the weapon that social movements and minorities can use against the state if it tries to do any of the bad shit Gov talks about. It is how a minority can ask the public, if you prick me, will I not bleed? Can you really cut off my tongue if I speak your language and come from the same soil as you? It is how opposition parties can disgrace the incumbents for wasting the nation's money on corruption. The upshot of all of this is that in our worst case, and if you don't buy anything, it can be used for either side, either good things or bad things. So at the very least, this argument washes out because the content of national identity can be used to either build or destroy. Now, there are reasons why the states promote this well. All of the reasons Matt gave you, but here's where I'm going to simplify it. All of the reasons Matt gave you are an upshot to show that the arc of history is likely to bend towards being inclusive. As information becomes more accessible, as people engage with one another and see that religion shouldn't divide as much, or they see the harms and the crimes of genocide, as human rights become more accessible, that is to say, even across time, it is likely that states become inclusive and people believe the nation should be inclusive. Why are states likely now to do it better than the counterfactual that I proved to you is inevitable? One, the state is the most unifying and legitimate actor. Op says, but minorities get discriminated against. Here's the response. Discrimination does not require the bludgeon of national identity. It just requires hate in your heart and a slight difference in beliefs or bodily features of the other. So what's the comparative on op? You have different actors with zero-sum political interests emerge to each form their own fragmented identities. Why? Because of Gov's own characterization. It's a powerful mobilization tool for pernicious interests as Gov themselves characterize. So pernicious actors will create fragmented identities that do the exact same thing. What's the world on Gov? We counteract discrimination because everyone is a sibling of one another, no matter their skin color. They are from the same soil, and the nation itself says that everybody is part of the country. Insofar as I gave you the characterization for why this is likely and they have the incentive to, but it is the only actor that can do it on the national level to mitigate any form of discrimination. So on the incentive and capacity level, it's likely. Why is this important? To feel secure in the identity compared to competing identities where you're unsure of which is legitimate, and to stop internal and external conflict between groups. But secondarily, it's comparatively on our side more participatory and inclusive. Why? Because people can participate in that dialogue of what it means to be part of the nation, even the minorities. Why? Because the state has incentive to listen to people because it wants to include as many people as possible. Why? Matt gave you a number of reasons. I'll add some more. To some degree, every individual is represented by a representative at the national level that will speak for them. Secondarily, every district matters in close elections. Thirdly, they don't want to seem like they're shutting out anyone insofar as there's established states usually have some degree of free press that can penalize them. And fourthly, if they are too exclusive, counter-state identities manifest and lead to the instability that they want to promote. That is to say, see the analysis that I gave before and how it can be weaponized. There's a comparative less ability to be unified on Gov side because there's no platform or mechanism to speak to, no entity regulates the discussion, and no one can make them feel like they're truly part of the country if it's not the national level. CG, quickly.
So why is this under the remit of legitimate actions of a state? Because we don't think that it is.
The reason why it's legitimate is because if you think the state should not impose itself and it is manipulating people, that manipulation is likely to exist on either side. The difference is that the state can stop the bad kinds of manipulation that I previously explained, insofar as that bad kind of manipulation can be things like the toxic, fragmented identities that lead to the kind of instability on either side. In other words, there's a pill that will be given to the citizens on either side of the house. The state has an obligation to give them the right kind of pill. So we also win on the principle. Now, why are you more likely to race to the bottom and be exclusive with the identities that Gov talks about. Other actors, when they cannot be inclusive at the national level, have incentives to be the most inflammatory and rile people up at the local or regional level, because that's how they can mobilize people the most. Be exclusive because it makes them feel unique and heard, because they can never do it at the national level. Now, even if you buy none of that, I want to engage with the idea of, but people can still have some sort of identity with a globalized world and new communities to get some sort of catharsis in the world. Any identity that is not the national is, one, more fickle because it changes as the world changes. Two, doesn't feel as homely because everyone is part of the club, so therefore no one is. And thirdly, it's not inherent to where you live and your culture and the soil that you raised you and your children in. Nations can be horrible, but the identities they craft are a saving grace in this world.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Member of Government to begin the case for closing government. Hear, hear.
Hey, just a moment, let me get my timer. Imagine a boot pressing down on the face of humanity again and again for centuries. I really like that intro, but it's actually more relevant to our case. People think me and Dylan run principles all the time because we use philosophical analysis for consequential impacts. This is going to be a proper fucking principle. I want to note one point of kind of washing up top, because insofar as the powerful actors and societal forces that opening opposition mentioned likely may gain control over state apparatus on their sort of house, given that they are powerful ones, I think that means oftentimes that their form of this ends up being the exact same as the national form, meaning there is no real difference between the two different kinds of narratives of national identity we get between state actors and non-state actors in top half, mitigating a lot of them comparatively. I want to note Ahmed's POI Ahmed's POI response is not sufficient, because this isn't about providing a countervailing force insofar as some of these forms of national identity don't include certain people. Rather, this principle is stating that it is illegitimate for the state to attempt to try and include anyone, any person, any one individual as someone which it should be bound to that state and bound to that national identity in and of itself. That is our claim within the debate, but this is fundamentally illegitimate in all instances. What does the state do? Because quite simply and quite trivially, it limits our range of possible actions, right? It sets out a list of things quite clearly, what we can and cannot do, not always clearly, but like black and white lists of things that we can and cannot do, or things that we must do in certain instances, all of these kinds of things. And crucially, it enforces this via the threat and actualization of violence. That is to say, you have to follow the law, or else we will literally beat you with batons. We will lock you in a tiny, stifling cage, perhaps in solitary confinement, depending on just how bad the thing we think that you did is, or perhaps we will fine you greatly, removing your ability to make decisions, i.e. decide what you want to buy in life, because you just don't have the money. It routinely acts as a form of violence against you, either through threatening to do it and thus making you not want to choose things which you otherwise would choose, or taking away your capacity to choose anything because it takes away your agency insofar as you can't do things when you're locked up in prison. Thus, what the state does, its fundamental acting out within the world, is that of pushing us down and making sure we have no agency and limiting that to a huge extent. Crucially, I want to note that the state trying to justify this via benefits is uncertain, insofar as we don't know what people may necessarily want or may want to consent to, i.e. even things like systems of benefits of welfare, not everyone actually wants. Some people don't want handouts and these kinds of things. For those actors, they don't want that benefit. It's as if someone just came down the street and threw a book in their window and was like, okay, I gave you something, now I can do whatever the fuck I want to you. It's not legitimate in and of itself. You can only know what they want via the mechanism of voting. And crucially, voting, we say, is that which legitimizes the state in any instance. First of all, because it's necessary for benefits to be certain, but secondly, because it means that we in ourselves have some control over that which controls us. That is to say, it is a form of restorative agency. If the state sets out a list of things which I can and cannot do, and if I can at least somewhat control what is on that list and how the state enforces it, then I have at least some agency restored to me and some of that original theft given back, meaning crucially that it in some sense legitimizes the state. However, this is not a perfect mechanism in and of itself. There are burdens which must be met. A, and this is crucially where we'll note on the motion. We'll note A, the idea that majority rule can be problematic. That is to say, well, like if you're in a room of like 6 people and 4 people decide to beat the other 2 up in a vote, like that's still kind of fucked, right? Because crucially, what you need is that the majority rule in such instances are only acceptable and only legitimate if it is accepted in the first instance by everyone by whom the majority rule kind of oppresses in some sense. That is to say, if we as a demos, which is the voting public, the citizens of the state, these kinds of things, have actively consented into the collaborative project which is statehood, we all go, yes, we will vote, and sometimes I may lose and you will win, but it is a collaborative project together. We were all trying to further our collective interests. Crucially then, this must exist independently of the state, because if the state were to attempt to foster the sense of togetherness, the sense of collaborative project, it would be justifying its theft via actually via directly going, no, we are forcing you to accept this. We are making sure you will stand over the fact that we are beating up those 2 people. We say those 2 people must consent freely without this state. Note that you may be thinking, but what about your framing, Jack? I will note that the consequence of this is not that like we can't have national identity at all necessarily. The consequence, therefore, is that the state is illegitimate in trying to then foster and create and curate these national identities. Because even if it would exist independently of the state, it must only exist independently of the state, because that is the only thing which justifies any state action. Therefore, the state attempting to do this at all is illegitimate insofar as it smears the independence of this as a notion, as a factor of life, etc. Oh well.
The problem with this principle is that insofar as we're an absence of promotion of this narrative is also imposing an ideology on people, because action and omission are
no. So crucially then on the next things, the idea of I'll explain how this is. So coerced votes, because crucially, separately, what if your votes are coerced? What if you're not able to vote out the state in and of itself, i.e. you want to get rid of the list and the ability to enforce it altogether? What if you cannot do that? And crucially, what if ultimately you are not able to form these preferences without the state pointing to something, i.e. even this speaking is not speaking at all? I would note ultimately then is that we do have the capacity to form preferences to some extent. We consider things as the nature of human will and human free will. If you don't have free will, I'm not sure what fucking matters, but crucially it's our ability to weigh up different options and different course of options and to weigh them up ourselves to consider which we would like. Crucially then, ultimately, this means that we have an ability to negotiate with partial narratives, but that must be maximized to some extent, insofar as the state is also doing it. We'd say that is pushing forward power now, so that is also bad. But crucially, we must be able to freely critically analyze the concept of the state itself without the state preventing us from do this. This is why we have things such as freedom of expression. It's why we know if a parent tells you to believe certain things politically, we say that bias is somewhat acceptable. But if a teacher does it, it is not, because the teacher is servicing in a role for the state more widely. And then the state is trying to justify itself and trying to coerce its preferences and trying to do all these things. Crucially, thus, this is the state itself trying to coerce the preferences. And to do so would mean we never have true control over the state, because we can never, ever conceptualize getting rid of it, because ultimately it attaches itself to this idea of national identity. First of all, naturally, insofar as it is the one promoting national identity, we associate it with the state. But secondly, if this national identity is popular, it tries to say everything it does was for that in order to legitimize itself. Crucially then, this is fundamentally illegitimate in all instances. I don't care. I think we watch the rest anyway, but I just don't care. It's illegitimate.
I'd like to thank the member of government for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the member of opposition to begin the case for closing opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, I'm just checking that I'm clearly audible.
You are.
Awesome. I'll take a point in the chat, ideally. All right, and I'll get started in 3, 2, 1. Perhaps it's just because it's 8 a.m. here and I've been awake all night, but I'm so confused as to what is exclusive in this debate. And so this member speech is just going to be devoted, I think, to sorting out what is unique to patriotism. And that's going to take 3 parts. The first one is to explain what this process of curation actually looks like, which I think responds pretty powerfully to the government bench. The second thing I'm going to do is explain a set of unique benefits of patriotism that cannot be achieved through other national identity formation methods. And then finally, I'll just do some problems of the comparative that I think are unresponded to, despite some nice POIs from us. All right, firstly, how does this curation work? Because I think the other teams in the debate are insufficiently attentive to the way that curation occurs. And there are two things that I want to observe about it. The first thing I want to explain is why it needs to be inclusive. And I think what we get from OO is just like some defensive material about how there are probably incentives to be inclusive. But I think the problem with that is there's actually like the more powerful reason why patriotism is inclusive is given in OG, who tell us that patriotism is fundamentally a method of building buy-in and connection to states. Patriotism is used to build unity and consensus around state policies. But that is the very reason why it is likely to be inclusive, because fundamentally the purpose of this identity formation is to get people to buy in. And indeed, they then concede that, for example, immigrants can buy into the American project. Immigrants can opt into American patriotism. And what that, I think, very clearly suggests is that this patriotism is likely to be constructed in a way that allows people to opt in, that is not based on ascriptive characteristics, but instead involves a unique conversation about the concept of the nation rather than other counterfactual forms of identity. The second thing I would note is just that, note that the unique thing about patriotism, as I just said, is about having a concept of nation that allows for love and support of that nation. That involves the active creation of understanding about what is unique and indeed positive about that state. What does that process look like? The first thing that I want to note is that it is usually contested. And opening government themselves concede that there are huge political dividends to be gained from talking about national identity, from talking about patriotism in a way that is persuasive to people. And that is the very reason why it is likely that it is contested, why it is likely that different parts of politics use notions of patriotism and use different narratives about what the state ought to be. And clearly that matters because this is highly democratically tested, right? It's democratically tested because the politicians that can articulate that national identity in the most appealing way are likely to get elected, but also just because the operation of patriotism, the way that it is promoted, requires it to ring true for people. Like if no one turns up to your national rally, you look pretty stupid. The patriotism does not work. You need people to fly the flag. You need people to barrack for your national team. You need people to really connect with the concept of nation. And that is why it is likely to be actually aligned with the values of that state, because people need to positively believe in it, because people need to be motivated to love their country. Note that this responds also to closing government, who claim that it is democratically illegitimate to impose this kind of coercive force that makes people love their country. But we kind of come above that, right? Because we explain that this is a participatory process, that states by definition need to create a patriotism that people want to buy into, that can get the benefits of unity, I guess the detriments, if you're opening government, but that can get the unity that all teams, I guess, so far in this debate describe. So that's what the process of curation looks like. That's why it's likely participatory. And note that that's really important for responding to government bench, who require, I think, quite an uncharitable picture of how this works, where it's just prescribed from above. The facts say that it doesn't. They don't respond effectively to our point about the ways that these narratives are shaped and contested, but additionally, the mere definition of patriotism as something that creates unity, as something that creates love of country, requires it to connect with people emotionally and viscerally. I hope that seems important. All right, the next thing to say is just some unique benefits of patriotism. Two really important things here. The first thing is that I think, I want to know, opening opposition is extremely defensive. They're like, well, it's not fragmented and it is coherent. But we go further. We say that it involves the active promotion and protection of things that people love about their country, of things that are really important to people. That looks like, for example, promoting the environment in many countries. Like the National Parks project started as a result of a love of country, of a huge amount of buy-in, looking like a lot of folk poetry or folk music coming out that is incredibly patriotic, that describes a deep connection to things like the natural environment surrounding people. Also, we think this means you do things like protect and promote cultural products that are unique to the state. The structural reason for that is you've got to identify the things that are unique and special about that state, things that people believe in and find really important. And that, I think, is hugely important just in terms of giving people things that they love, connect to, and that are life enriching. I'm going to take a point from opening now.
Argue that patriotism is built to get buy-in, but we say that is terrible insofar as the buy-in is contingent on national parks and rallies rather than actual policy that serves the needs of the people, because you can distract them from your failure to provide that.
I mean, I just don't think that people are very likely to buy into a nation of state that oppresses them, that leaves them in grinding poverty. I think that clearly states that are able to provide people with economic opportunity often have strong senses of patriotism because people love that. They believe it is important to their kind of status as being that nationality. The final thing I'm going to do in this argument about unique benefits is explain why this protects against aggression and imperialism, because I think we hear a lot about how powerful states utilize this, but clearly these states have strong institutions like corporations and media. They can use fear and exclusion even if they don't have patriotism. And I don't think that the government bench does enough work to explain why this is the tipping point. We say that by contrast, it is the less powerful states that need patriotism to create unity, to act as a bulwark against things like neocolonialism. It is why people in Ukraine can fight to the death to protect their country against Russia. It is why post-colonial states can unite despite the fact, over a history of liberation. Those things were important and they were unique to those states in a way that repression was not. The final thing is just some problems of the comparative. I think that the opposition bench broadly suggests that it is likely that politicians still try to do division in order to get elected. Like they still want people to vote for them. They still likely cater to identity. They just do it in less inclusive ways. But the other thing I want to note is that I think that comparative as well is greater repression for the reason that opening government says that this makes people support the state. The state clearly wants and requires support in either world. I think the way they do it under their side is far more repressive. I think that they crush dissidents in a way rather than just getting them on board, rather than building love for their country, they use force more, they use it on more people. That creates suffering as well. So proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the member of opposition for his fine speech. I'd like to call upon the government whip to close off the case for closing government. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
You are.
Let's start by discussing the moral metric of this debate. Jack gave you a lot of analysis here. I want to go even deeper into way. We hold that morality is either undeterminable or very difficult to determine, but we can use a falsification approach. We can determine what can't be a morally important characteristic and derive moral outcomes or moral imperatives from there. Therefore, anything that is arbitrary is the thing which is not morally important, because by definition it is arbitrary. There cannot be reason within it. We hold that who you are born into, which is say your ascriptive characteristics, or even your positionality, are arbitrary characteristics there. Therefore, respect for moral agents and equal moral agency should be the premise of any moral system, because who a person is and what perspective they represent is an arbitrary thing. The only action which respects moral agency of the other is the consensual action, which is why we think that consent is the most important characteristic here. Notably, as we explained, you can't impose a preference and then fulfill it, i.e. post hoc consent, because ultimately this is not respect for the moral agency of the other, but rather a recognition of your own will through them as an instrument. Insofar as the initial action was illegitimate, the corollary preference bears no moral significance, which is why you can't create a national identity and then fulfill that national identity's promises and have that be a good thing. Notably, this is important analysis here. The state is unique insofar as its legitimacy is premised on the preferences that would exist in its absence, as opposed to, say, for example, conventional persuasion, where you persuade someone of a particular idea. This is why a lot of the private actor analysis and the rest of the debate is irrelevant for our case, because it's about the specific instance of the state taking an action. OO say it's a vehicle to undermine moral incoherence. But of course, the only way you would believe that this is a bad thing is if you believe that clarity is an a priori good. But we say that clarity along a fixed moral value is not always a moral good. It can be only good when you arrive at that from a particular perspective. And it also precisely mechanizes our case as to why you are indeed imposing a worldview upon a particular individual. Second thing I'm going to talk about then is the state. We say the premise of its legitimacy is the aggregation and representation of preferences. Notably, it has to be the preferences that existed prior to the state or absent the state's imposition. At each time slice, the state must represent existing preferences. But definitionally, a state national identity can't exist without the existence of the state. It's definitionally not an ideal or preference that people would hold absent the existence of a state. Similarly, given that you still retain some control over the state, you still retain some coercion under the state, this is only legitimate insofar as you can consent to that coercion by believing in a collaborative project, that everyone has a communal identity. Notably, if this would not exist in the absence of the state would by definition be illegitimate. Therefore, the state is illegitimate in taking actions which have the intention to create such an identity. That's two strands under which the action of the state's construction of national identity is an illegitimate one. I'm going to go through some basic weighing in two strands before I go to specific team weighing. Basic weighing is two things. Firstly, this is an absolute deontological wrong. Given that there's been no justification for the practical considerations from the rest of the debate, this is, it is a prior harm that has to be considered with primacy. Secondly, time is an important factor here. So you can't impose any deontological value to the consequences of this kind of thing without considering the action first. Because if the initial action is illegitimate, any future consequences are irrelevant to it. Let's go into specific team comparisons. Opening government. To their credit, they make claims on access to the political system with minority status, veneer of legitimacy, and populism. Two weighing metrics on this, though. Firstly, just blanket weighing. We explain the importance of these claims, bringing them from intuitive harms to illegitimate actions, therefore increasing the persuasiveness of the government bench significantly. Secondly, our analysis applies in all contexts, both to majorities within states, but also liberal states that do not do this kind of thing to the same extent. Second weighing mechanism overall against OG is their claims on violence, because you might intuit that the harm of state violence is that you consent to the legitimacy of violence and that makes the violence fine. But we say the harm isn't the violence, the harm is the violation of consent in the first place, which means that the violation of consent is a more primary moral consideration than the outcome of violence that comes as a corollary of it. So we explain the importance of that violence to a much higher degree on our side within the context of this analysis. With regards to opening opposition, then, three things. Firstly, note I've already dealt with their principle of moral incoherence, explaining how it further proves our case that the state does indeed impose a particular preference on individuals. Ahmed's response was that it happens anyway, therefore the state must intervene as a kind of corrective factor. Two things, though. Firstly, the other actors who control this narrative, be they media moguls, organic movements, etc., are legitimate in portraying and representing their perspectives. Indeed, we would say it's imperative that they have the ability to do so. Secondly, this only makes sense as a response under a consequentialist framework. But we said the individuated action is always illegitimate. They're saying that you're trying to correct a consequence, but that doesn't make the action itself any more legitimate. Secondly, they said it's an inclusive narrative that incorporates all values. And maybe then in the perfect circumstance of mirror reflection of the identity of individuals collected together and concatenated, this would be legitimate. But of course, their own case disputes this because they explain how you have an incoherent, ambiguous concept of national identity absent the state's construction of it. And therefore, the state would not, by definition, be able to perfectly correlate those identities into an overall framework unless it initially provided a premise there. The action and action distinction then, which is Matt's POI to Jack, actually exists here because the state is only legitimate in taking action insofar as it exists. But the state's existence requires like a legitimation which only happens is disputed by the taking of the action in the first place. There actually is an action and action distinction here, because that's quite consequentialist conception. Our analysis here, which is more deontological, actually proves why there would be a distinction there. Opening opposition.
Yep. Moral agents don't consent to the deontological harm of OG's theoretical global identity or the imposition of bottom-up identities we proved happened on OO. I'm fine with pushing you out of the way of a car to save your life, even if there is a deontological harm, it's smaller.
No, but the reason why it's fine to push someone out of the car to save their life is because you have a direct understanding of the fact that they on aggregate would have likely consented to that kind of thing. But the state can't weigh up those hypothetical preferences. Also, see our analysis on why the state is a specific kind of actor in these instances. I don't think this analysis responds. I also think it's bad form to respond to OG and a POI. We're beating you anyway. Two responses to CO. Firstly, they say it's aligned with your values, but notably in the absence of this, it seems like this would still exist, right? Like, I mean, if the aligned values were aligned anyways, why do you need the state to construct it? But notably, if it's bringing together certain values, that strengthens those preferences, even if it's drawing values out of where they already exist. And see, for example, in the instance of voting, where we have to decide between individual preferences, that would still be illegitimate, even if the preferences already existed. Secondly, they say it's a unifying thing, but this is harmful in and of itself, because we explained to you the importance of being able to conceive of a disunified state, to conceive of an identity that exists absent that unification. Unification is an a priori harm under our analysis, and therefore this claim from closing opposition is also going to lose from this. From us. Panel, we've explained all the ways in which you might consider the action of a state to be legitimate, and why in those instances it is not legitimate for the state to use its apparatus to form a national identity. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the government whip for what was a fine speech. I'd like to call upon the opposition whip to close off the case for closing opposition. Here.
Hey, just confirming that I'm clearly audible.
You are.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opening government in this debate relies on an extreme and I think by now defeated characterization of governments weaponizing patriotism cynically and for evil. Opening opposition is extremely defensive. They hang their hat on the claim that other kinds of identity formation are inevitably worse. Closing government doesn't really rebut us, which is a little bit sad. Closing opposition's debate-winning claim is in fact very simple. We say patriotism is not simply the lesser of two evils, it's a profound moral good. Its loss is a tragedy, and it is preferable not only to other forms of identity, but to other forms of non-patriotic national identity, which is the comparative. Two things in this speech. Firstly, I'll rebut closing government. Secondly, I'll explain why closing opposition wins. Firstly, on closing government, their extension goes like this. They say, patriotism is coercive, arbitrary, and self-justifying, thus it is principally illegitimate. A number of responses to this argument. The first thing I'd note is that patriotism is in many ways consented to the same way that other democratic policy is consented to. For instance, the fact that you vote for governments, which then do things like set history curricula in order to promote this national identity. And I would note that our extension, which receives almost no response from that previous team, explains very clearly why patriotism is indeed participatory in a way that other forms of national identity is not. But I note, secondly, that closing government's problem with majority rule, if that stands, is just a problem with democracy broadly. It is not specific to this motion, and presumably many of the things they defend are vulnerable to those problems as well. But the second thing I'd note is that we in general just have imperfect consent to many kinds of government processes. In particular, the more ephemeral they are, the less we demand perfect consent. Things like consenting to culture, which is what we're talking about here, we probably require less perfect consent than we would to consenting to tax policy. Even less ephemeral things, like for instance, the law is something that is not always in many ways totally democratically accountable. We think that is fine where there are trade-offs to be made, significant trade-offs for utility, which is what we prove. But the third thing we'd observe is that the comparative is identities which just are coercive as well. We explained that the comparative is non-patriotic national identity, which presumably runs, is vulnerable to exactly the same responses that closing government gives. They say, well, even if it exists regardless, it's still bad for the state to participate. No reason is given as to why that is true, or pretty weak reasons. We think you should choose the most utile form of identity, which is what we give you. But fourthly, I just question how important consent is in this instance, right? I would say many kinds of non-consensual or arbitrary structures or relationships are indeed morally important and impose obligations on people. Things like family, which is fundamentally arbitrary and something you don't consent to, still imposes important duties of love and care on people who happen to be born into those kinds of families. We recognize that those things are utile. We recognize that those things are indeed deontologically important. I think the most interesting sort of permutation of the argument we hear from closing government is like, well, the state itself should not be self-justifying, right? And I just would question why not? Like, would you not allow, for instance, incumbent political parties to contest re-election? I think you would. And that is because the self that is being justified or the state that is being justified can change, right? Those incumbent politicians are still held accountable by the fact that you have a democracy and they could potentially be voted out. And that is what we give you in the way that nationalism or patriotism rather is indeed participatory, can account for change. Closing government's principle is pretty incoherent. I don't think it stands in this debate. The second thing I'm going to talk about is our claim from Ellie, which is just that patriotism is extremely good. We should support it, and it is preferable to other forms of national identity. Before I do that, I'll take opening.
So to say that the characterization is already defeated when the only thing making patriotism good is accountability doesn't make sense. Our whole point is that patriotism is used to avoid accountability, hence making none of this material.
No, I don't think that's right, because we explain that patriotism supports accountability because what you want is for people to buy into a state. Like, the purpose of patriotism is that you want to have buy-in. It's intrinsically a positive view. And that means that when your state fails you, you can say, you are failing me in providing me a positive sense of national identity. That's why clearly that characterization falls to us. So why is patriotism so particularly good? I note that opening opposition says national identity is valuable because it's a coherent way of making sense of the world. And opening government's, I think, pretty fair response to this is the very reasonable question, well, what is uniquely clarifying or meaningful about this identity compared to others? Opening opposition can't really answer, but closing opposition does. What we explain clearly at LE is that patriotism is necessarily inclusive, responding to that POI. Its purpose is buy-in. That secondly, it's a distinctly positive form of identity rather than a negative one. That thirdly, it's participatory. It's contested by various sectors of politics and culture in a way that's incredibly important, in a way that allows for buy-in and indicates that the sense of identity you end up with is likely to be inclusive. That fourthly, it just involves the promotion of a range of really valuable social goods, things like nationalist poetry, like national parks, like an investment in sports, that it's just particularly meaningful for people who are part of it, who often don't have any capacity to opt out of their state. So you should make their experience a good one. And that fifthly, it disproportionately benefits less powerful states, which I think weighs in very neatly to the clash of the opening half, which is to say, yes, maybe in some instances, bad, powerful states use this to justify evil military intervention. They probably have the capacity to do that on either side. The delta then is for weaker states, post-conflict states that require this to build up a sense of identity when they don't have tools to rely on. What challenges do we get to these claims? Opening government says, well, these things like national parks and poetry are just distracting vanity projects. Firstly, if that's true, I think you'd say probably that is true of all like nice things that the state gives you or facilitates, things like funding for art and sports. I guess where those things are provided to oppress people, they can, you know, decrease your desire to have revolution. I think you should still fund things like art and sports. I think they are still intrinsically valuable parts of culture. But secondly, we explain very clearly that bad states are not viewed as pride-worthy, which is why our extension is prior to that. Closing government's basically only response to our extension is like, well, if your interests are aligned anyway, then you don't need the state to do this. But our claim is that your interests and your sense of inclusion and the participation is all strengthened and facilitated by the state, which is why this is necessary. The only other challenge is to say this is contingent on their principle, which I've already rebutted. Why then is this extension so important? Firstly, it is the clearest explanation of the delta in this debate. Closing opposition is the only team who reads the motion and understands this is not a debate about national identity, it is a debate about patriotic national identity. The counterfactual is therefore a sense of connection to your nation, which, allows states to wield some power over you. We think you should have a positive sense of connection to your nation through patriotism. Second, it most clearly explains why alternative identities are worse because they lack the specific benefits in inclusion, thus unlocking the claims made by opening opposition. Thirdly, it cleanly and generously rebuts opening government because regardless of the incentives of good or bad governments, the identity governments develop on our side is structurally a good one because patriotism is good. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition whip for his fine speech. I'd like to thank you all again for that debate. It was, I think, a phenomenal and great debate. However, we're now going to go and judge it. So I don't know if we're doing that here. I don't know if we're doing that somewhere
We
else.
have a breakout room.
We've got a breakout room. Amazing. Thank you so much. We'll be back in a bit.
Thanks, folks.